If you've been with us, we've been working through Matthew's gospel. Matthew's one of Jesus' 12 original apostles or sent out ones. And he wrote this collection of Jesus' life and a lot of Jesus' sayings. And it's been preserved ever since for us, so we get a window into Jesus. And one of Jesus' main themes throughout his whole ministry was this idea of God's kingdom. And it was something that Jesus wanted to start to bring to earth when he was there, and his disciples got to experience it. And hundreds of years later, we're getting to get a taste of it, and it's something where God has even more things, it seems, in store in the future related to that, and truly bringing this world and even beyond this world back to a place where he originally started before people sinned against God and walked away from him, and a lot of things got broken in this world. So that's the big picture. But last week we were looking at some different parables that Jesus gives in chapter 13 of Matthew. And these parables are short stories. A fable would be a short story that uses animals or things like that, like Aesop's fables, to give you some moral or some lesson. A parable is a short story that uses people to teach you something about something. And what Jesus is teaching about, he's very clear. We talked about that 2 Sundays ago. He's teaching about God's kingdom. And so all these parables are pictures to show us little insights into this thing called God's kingdom. And we'll get a couple of more insights this morning from two or three parables that Jesus shares that we'll take a look at. I want to begin, though, with kind of a different picture for a sermon. You can go to the next slide if you want. So these are 2 types of almonds. On the left side, you see what are called bitter almonds. On the right side are what you see called sweet almonds. And what you are used to experiencing are sweet almonds. It's not even legal to sell bitter almonds in the United States because all almonds have a little bit of cyanide in them. Cyanide, if you know, in mass quantities or even small quantities, can mess up your life. It can stop your respiratory system and thin your blood out and do all kinds of not great things. And so sweet almonds, they all contain just a small traces of that. But bitter almonds, if a child were to consume 5 to 10 of them, it would be fatal. And if you were to consume about 50 of them, it would be fatal. And really, there's not much difference. The bitter almonds are shorter and they're fatter, and sweeter almonds are more slender and longer, okay? And bitter almonds tend to grow on trees with pink blossoms. They're used ornamentally in landscaping here. So don't just walk to someone's landscape and start picking almonds and eating them because they might be the bitter ones. And characteristically, the sweet ones are on trees with white blossoms. But at first glance, it's very difficult to tell them apart. Yet one could threaten your life, and the other one could be quite enjoyable and pleasant, even during the holiday season, right? It's something you have to exercise caution with. And Jesus is going to tell us a parable this morning and about 2 things, and those 2 things are eerily similar. But one has the power to provide nutrition and to restore your life, and the other one in the parable has the ability to destroy you, to bring death. And so we're going to look at that parable first this morning. I want to get into that. And I want to start off by just reading this parable to us, and then also by stopping to comment on what's going on and what this really is, because it's an agricultural one. So maybe some of you are really into planting and harvesting wheat. Many of us are not. So we got to step back into first century agriculture a little bit to understand what Jesus is talking about and kind of the gravity that's behind all this. But here's what he says. It's on really tiny print up there, so if you like to follow along with your ears, you can listen, or if you want to pull up a Bible on your phone or from the seat in front of you, or you have your own, you're welcome to. We're in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30 right now. This is the parable, and then Jesus is going to do us the favor of explaining it as well. It says, Jesus presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, those terms are used kind of interchangeably, can be compared to a person who sowed or planted good seed in a field. Okay? But while people were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds. Some of your translations say tares. And that's a very specific plant, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. It's a type of ryegrass that's called darnel. We'll talk about that. It says, when the plant sprouted and produced grain, the weeds also appeared. So both seeds are planted, no one knows what's happened, and then they start to come up. And the landowner's slaves came to him and said, Master, didn't you plant good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from? Where did this ryegrass, this darnel come from? An enemy did this, he told them. So do you want us to go and gather them up, the slave said. No, he said, because when you gather the wheat, the grain, you might also, the weeds and the wheat, in gathering the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. The reason why is because they're really tricky to distinguish, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at harvest time I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and tie them up into bundles and burn those, but store the wheat in my barn because it's valuable, it's food, it's nourishing. And so this is supposed to give us some insights into God's kingdom, and we'll talk about those insights in a moment, but I want to talk about the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares first. So if you can go on to the next slide. Where is the wheat in this picture? Can you tell? It's kind of similar. How many of you would say the wheat is on the left? Wheat is on the left. How many of you say the wheat is on the right? Yeah. I don't know. I'm just kidding. The wheat's actually on the right. The wheat's on the right. Some of you are like, I'm right. Yeah. But it was a good guess, right? So this is the wheat, but they're very tricky to distinguish. You can see in the fields. And if you go on to the next slide here, these are how the roots of the wheat typically form. You throw some seeds down and several kind of bundles of wheat. They all grow up, but the roots are together. So you can imagine if you're pulling weeds and you're pulling wheat, and you pull the weeds out, you get some wheat along with it. So you're just going to destroy your field if you try to pick out those pieces of darnel or tares or weeds from your wheat. They both look very similar. You can go ahead and go to the next slide for a moment. And when they're closer to harvest time, the darnel is again on the left and the wheat is on the right. And as they get closer to harvest time, the darnel tends to stay upright and the wheat tends to bend because the grains are heavier. And again, this darnel is green, but when they dry, they both become the same color of brown, essentially. But you can see the darnel seeds, and they have this black stripe kind of on them because the grain is actually a darker black color, and the wheat is more of a lighter brown, what we would call wheat color, right? And so really, it's hard to tell the difference until the grains appear and the fruit appears. And when it does, you can tell the wheat from the weeds because the weeds are still upright and the wheat bends. And the grain structure is slightly different, and then the seeds look slightly different. But all throughout history, this darnel has been a plague because it's very difficult to separate. The other interesting thing about darnel is it doesn't grow by itself. It gets harvested along with wheat, and then you have to replant it, just like you do wheat from year to year. And so this enemy in the story kind of did some painstaking work to separate these two at harvest time. So he had this, pouch with some really dangerous weeds behind it. These darnel seeds that look a lot like wheat, they are actually kind of intoxicant and hallucinogenic. And so if you mix this in with bread, it will cause you to seem intoxicated or even maybe to hallucinate slightly. There's a toxin that's in there. And in large enough quantities, it could even kill you. But most of the time, it just messes with your mind and your fine motor skills and those kinds of things. And so there was actually sort of a stupor or a drunkenness that was associated with accidentally baking bread with too much darnel in it. And so it was something that was destructive, and the enemy put this in the field to destroy whoever might consume bread by mixing the good grain with the bad grain. And so that's really the premise of Jesus' story. When we read that, we don't necessarily dive into the details of that. But that's what's happening here. And I think the reason why Jesus is telling us this story, and he's going to explain it in a moment, so we'll see what his emphasis is to tell us that there is a difference between living as a part of God's kingdom in this world, like the wheat does in the field. And the field, Jesus says here, it is the world in a moment. There's a difference between being wheat, between being in God's kingdom, looking to restore life in this world, looking to restore eternal life through faith in Christ, looking just to restore the kind of life that God intended when he put man and woman in the garden long, long ago. That's a different ambition than it is just going through life, living for yourself, or even worse, being affected by evil and causing destruction. So there's kind of two paths through life, and you're one of two identities. You're either the wheat that's bringing nourishment and goodness, or you're the tares, the weeds, the darnel that's bringing actually kind of a quiet destruction that's underlying it. And so a couple of observations. This is how Jesus interprets this parable, starting in verse 38, again in Matthew 13. It says, then he dismissed the crowds and went into the house. And Jesus does this throughout all of these different parables. Because as we learned 2 weeks ago, these parables contain secrets, but they're for people who are really seeking. And most of the people that heard Jesus, chapter 12 told us, most of the people are either kind of just complacent, like, that's a nice story, Jesus. That was kind of a cool miracle, but we're really not interested. or they're critical, which is maybe even worse. So very few people are actually responsive to what Jesus is teaching. So he's teaching in these parables so that the people who are really seeking and searching maybe can come to him later for some more insight, or so that the Holy Spirit can provide them with more insights. So he's teaching in these parables. He's also teaching about God's kingdom, which again, it's not a place. We think of it as maybe like heaven or here on earth, but it's really people. It's people who submit to Jesus as king, so we're submitting to his rule, and we're also relating with him. We're in this relationship with him as king. And we're seeking to live by allowing him to reign in our lives as our king. So he's influencing our thoughts and our choices and our decisions and how we go through life. And so he truly is the king, and we are kind of his representatives here on earth. That's the idea behind the kingdom now. And then it seems like in the future, Jesus actually brings that in a physical sense to earth at some point in time. But we're not there yet. And so for us, it's this relationship and us representing him in the world and trying to live according to his teachings, which he lays out in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. But there's some differences of that way of life versus just the free-for-all, living for myself, living for the kingdom that I'm building in this world, whatever ambition that happens to be. And it seems like this parable sets out the differences. So he's calling his disciples to him and speaking to them because they want to listen. And they actually say, Jesus, can you explain the parable of the weeds in the field to us? And so he gives them an explanation because they want to listen and they want to seek. He says, the person who's planting the good seed is the Son of Man. This title Jesus used to describe himself. It speaks of this Messiah, this future king coming in the Old Testament. It's a term that's used in a few different books by a few different prophets in the Old Testament. So he says, essentially, I'm the one who's planting this good seed, who's bringing this kingdom into existence. The field is the world. So there's, all kinds of seeds being planted in the world. Jesus is planting some of us, bringing us into his kingdom. He says, the good seed, these are the sons and daughters of the kingdom. And so if Jesus is your king today, if you're living for him, if you're trusting in him as your king, and if you're relating with him, then you are that wheat in the parable. He says, the weeds are the sons and daughters of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. So he's spelling this out. The enemy sowed this to corrupt God's world because God is the landowner. The whole world belongs to him. And so the devil is working as God's enemy in this world. And he's planting people who are basically jumping into his way of life and his kingdom or their own kingdoms, this selfish way of living that Satan tried to introduce to fight against God. And so there's two opposing forces that are at work in this world. That's the first thing we can take from this parable. There's good that's nourishing the world, and Jesus is spearheading that. And there's also evil that's destroying this world, and the devil is spearheading that. And depending on whose side we line up, depends on what kingdom we're considered to be in, and whether we're considered to be wheat with Jesus or the tares working for Jesus' enemy, who's the devil. Second thing, every person belongs to one of two families because they're actually called sons and daughters here, right? Jesus sees the relationship there. And so we're a part of a family. We're either a part of the owner's family, who owns the field, who owns the world, who is the Son of Man, who is Jesus, or a part of the enemy's family, who is the devil, who is opposing God and opposing goodness in the world and trying to destroy this world, which is God's field, God's land. So the question is, what family are we in? And so this is a little bit introspective. It causes us to kind of funnel ourselves into one side or the other. He continues on, and this is actually, I'm going to repeat this from the story of the parable itself because it gives us an insight that Jesus' explanation does not. Verses 26 to 30, when the plant sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared, so the darnel came up. The landowner's slaves came to him and said, Master, didn't you sow the good seed in the field? Where'd the weeds come from? Came from an enemy. And then they say, do you want us to go and pick them up, pluck them up? And he says, no, because when you gather the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat, right? So here's an observation from that comment. It's nearly impossible to tell the wheat and weeds apart. And you can look around you in this world, and if you had to pick out people who were following Jesus and submitting to his rule in their lives and believed he is this coming king, this promised savior from God, God in the flesh, from the people that don't, I mean, if we're in a room with 100 people, some of them are Jesus followers, some of them are not, do you honestly think you could pick out people at first glance based on their outer appearance? No chance, right? We all look. incredibly alike. We're all human. We're even all made in God's image, according to Genesis, chapters 1, chapter 2. So it's hard to tell the difference. It's hard to tell who's living for God's kingdom and who's living for their own kingdom or even for the evil one's kingdom in this world until something happens. And that's until they produce fruit. That's what distinguishes the weeds from the wheat. It's when the fruit comes out, the fruit's patterned different and it hangs differently, it's heavier, and it's a different color on the wheat than it is on the weeds. It's the same way with us. And so I think the question for us as we look into this is, what is the fruit of people who are following Jesus? And what is the fruit of people who are not? And I think it gets really tricky because we tend to, maybe in our culture here, but even in America, tend to think about all the externals. We think about, well, what are our accomplishments? Because surely the people who are living for Jesus, they're going to have better accomplishments. Or they're going to be more involved in serving, doing more community service and getting out there or giving to charity in the world or making sacrifices or just at least being more active, in their communities and making the most of their lives. But all those things aren't the type of fruit that really causes us to stand out. The fruit is more internal because Jesus always came to change the way that we think first, the way that our hearts operate, and then that affects us on the actions, the outside. So it's not our accomplishments and activity and service and sacrifices that cause us to stand out as God's kingdom. It's actually our attitudes and our motives, the thing inside of our hearts. And Paul talks about this in Galatians. So many different words in the Bible. Specific words are used, and they're a common theme throughout the Bible, and they're used for a reason, because they're supposed to point us back to the other places in your frame of reference, the other places in history in the Bible where those terms have come out. Jesus talks a lot about fruit, and Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. And he defines it not by all the things we're doing for God, but by things like love, unconditional love, and joy that we're experiencing even in suffering, peace, how patient we are with people, how kind we are, our faith and goodness, our gentleness with people, and our self-control. And that's how the fruit is distinguished. That's how you can tell who's living as a part of Jesus' kingdom. It's not all the things we're doing, it's our attitude and it's our motives. And then Paul contrasts that with people who are living for their own flesh, their own passions and their own desires. And he says they're following that. They become conceited. They end up provoking each other and getting into these fights and spats and envying each other. And those are the types of fruit that you see approaching on the tares, developing on the people who are not working for God in this world. And so it's hard to tell people apart. But Jesus goes on, he says, the harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. So we won't always be intermingled, both of these two kingdoms in the same field, so to speak. He says, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. So there's always going to be a blend of wheat and weeds, people who are part of God's kingdom and people who are part of the evil one's kingdom. In the world, it's always going to be hard to tell people apart at face value until you look at the heart. But there's going to be this moment where the weeds are gathered and they're separated out from this kingdom. Until the age is finished, Jesus says, at the end of the age. So when is the end of the age? There's only one verse in Scripture that comments on this. And here's kind of a rule of thumb. If there's only one verse that talks about something in the Bible, be super, super careful, because you might have the wrong take on it, right? And so I'm going to give you my take on it, but I'm going to say, hold this interpretation really loosely, right? Because it's only coming from one other verse in the Bible out of thousands. So don't say this is absolutely, certainly the way that it is. Later in Matthew, in chapter 24, Jesus, he's talking to his disciples in a private conversation, and they say, when are these things going to happen? Things that we would say are associated with more the end of time and the return of Jesus again to set up his kingdom on earth, to rule and reign on earth. They say, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? There's that phrase, end of the age. So it seems to be surrounding the time when Jesus is going to come again, not as a baby in a manger, but as a king with the power and the grandeur of God coming on the clouds from heaven down to earth. So it seems to be at that point in time when this separation is going to happen, finally. In verse 41, Jesus says, the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they'll gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin or ensnares And those who are guilty of lawlessness, those who are doing lawlessness, these are different words to describe the person who is acting on behalf of the evil one, who is a weed and not a wheat in the world. And he says they'll throw them into the blazing furnace where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so eventually the children of Jesus' kingdom and the children of the evil one are going to experience very, very polar opposite fates. That's going to be a huge difference in the outcome of this. And so the question is, well, can you elaborate a little bit more about those differences of fates, Jesus? And so Jesus tells another parable, a few verses down in the chapter, and I think this is to elaborate on those fates. He says, let me tell you something else. Not exactly like that. The kingdom of heaven is a large net thrown into the sea, and it collects every kind of fish. It's the same kind of thing. You've got a field, you've got all kinds of people in it. That's the world. You've got the sea, you've got all kinds of fish in it. Those are the variety of people in the world. And Jesus, there's this net that's cast into it. And so that's what the kingdom of heaven is like. He says, and when it was full, they dragged it ashore. So you've got this net with all kinds of fish. I think that shows us one thing just in those comments. God is patient, right? He's got this net out. He's just waiting. And when it's finally full, he pulls everything in. But there's going to be a point where his net is full, right? And that's not yet, because God's a patient God. And at that point, when the net's full, the fisherman sets down and gathers the good fish into containers, but throws out the worthless one. It could be rotten or useless or corrupt or whatever, just the fish that are not good for consumption. The fisherman separates those fish out. Jesus says, so it will be at the end of the completion of the age. End of the age, there's that phrase again. Sometime around when Jesus chooses to come again to the earth for the second time. He says around that time, the angels will go out, separate the evil people from the righteous. So eventually God's going to purge his kingdom by separating the evil from the righteous. And again, I think Jesus all along, he considers this world his kingdom, right? It's not him who corrupted it. It's us and the evil one who's been corrupting it. But this is kind of like, he's like, this is my world. This is my thing. And even more than that, he has plans even beyond this. But eventually he's going to purge this world and separate the evil from the righteous. And this appears to be living people, so Jesus is not concerned with people who have already died at this point, or people who will maybe die after this point. It's a separation of, I believe, living people at that point in time. So another question here is, who are the evil people and who are the righteous people? Because we all have our own definitions, right? We know who's evil. The evil people are the people who are worse than we are, right? And the righteous people are the people who are at least as good as we are or better, right? Those are the righteous and the evil. But Jesus spent a lot of time in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, I think, redefining our ideas about what righteousness is there. Because we're so good at looking at the outside and sizing each other up based on outward appearances and all of our accomplishments and all these things, all the things that we see. But the righteous ones, Jesus kind of redirects our attention to this. They're the people who are actually in right relationship with God and in a right relationship with other people. And the evil people who are, like many ways, the Pharisees, the religious leaders that we read about in all these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, they're the people who are not in a right relationship with God and not in a right relationship with people. They may be doing all the right things and being super, super religious, but they have zero mercy and compassion in their hearts. And they are definitely not concerned about a relationship with God or with Jesus. In fact, they're very critical of him. They accuse Jesus of being in league with Satan, just a couple chapters previously in Matthew. So they have all the wrong ideas. They think Jesus is a fraud. He's not God in the flesh. He's just this fake person out to draw all this attention to himself. They have all these wrong conclusions. And so those are the evil people who are good enough themselves, who have no need for God, who don't recognize Jesus, as God, or have really any need for God. They're good enough already. And so there's going to be a separation that occurs at some point in time. Maybe this is what Matthew 25 talks about, where Jesus tells a story about sheep and goats being separated and having two different destinies. We'll get to that later, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the idea is there are these polar opposite fates. Jesus says things like, the weeds get thrown into the blazing furnace where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the righteous shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. Okay? Those are two. You get the idea. Those are different demises or, glories in essence. And the idea behind weeping and gnashing of teeth, weeping is kind of self-explanatory. It's sadness. Okay? Gnashing of teeth, the reason why people would grit their teeth, this is an idiom. And so an idiom is a phrase that if you're a part of the culture, And if you're not a part of the culture, you have no clue what they're talking about, right? You have to be on the inside. You have to be a part of the culture to understand it. And so gnashing of teeth literally means gritting your teeth, but it's an expression that equals anger in their culture. And so the people who are separated out from God's kingdom, they're sad, and they're also extremely angry. Maybe they're angry because they were told a different story, or because they missed out, or because they were so focused on themselves, or because God would dare to send them a different way than his kingdom ultimately. But there's a lot of anger and a lot of sadness. And the latter, there's a lot of joy. There's a place of sadness and anger, and there's a place where people realize their true potential. And Malachi 4 actually describes it as playful joy. Playful joy. So those are two very different means. And Malachi 4, it uses that same imagery of a day. He says there's a day coming that's burning like a furnace when all the arrogant and people who commit wickedness will become stubble. The coming day, Jesus' arrival, it would seem, will consume them. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you'll go out and playfully jump like calves from the stall. So baby cows that are just excited to get out of the stall, because you let them out in the morning and they can run. You know, two different results. But there's differences depending on which kingdom you're aligned with, which one you're a part of. I want to conclude this morning by looking at two other very, very short parables that Jesus tells, really to point us in a total different aspect of God's kingdom, and that's the fact that it's kind of this discovery to be made. Kind of a discovery to be made. How many of you have gone and walked your dog recently, past few days? Anybody here? Okay, maybe one or two. All right. There was a couple, and they're from Sierra Nevada, California, and they took their dog out for a walk. They didn't even go far. They just went out into their backyard. And as they were walking their dog, they noticed that there was this rusty part of a can that was sticking up by the base of a tree in their yard. Maybe a recent rainstorm had uncovered it, or they just hadn't noticed, or maybe they have a little bit larger property and, hadn't been around that tree a lot, but they saw it sticking up out of the ground. And so they dug and they found this can, and it was filled with gold coins from the mid-1800s, minted in the United States in the mid-1800s. And then they dug some more, and they found 7 other rusted tin cans full of gold coins. These gold coins ended up being worth $10 million, and they were just hidden all this time in a rusty can buried in the backyard. And that's the imagery that Jesus tells us to kind of look toward in verses 44, 45, and 46 as we wrap up today. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure buried in a field that a person found and reburied. Now, in the story Jesus tells, the field doesn't actually belong to the person who found it. So, of course, this person, it says, in his joy, he goes and sells everything he has and buys the field, right? If there was a lot next door to your house, you're attached to your house, but there was a lot that had $10 million in gold coins buried, and the lot was priced at maybe, $200,000. Would you sell your property? Would you sell your property and purchase the lot next to you? How many of you might think about that for $10 million in gold coins? Okay. Well, this person is definitely thinking about it. And it was actually a practice in the ancient world to bury treasures. This is something that commonly happened. You can go to the next slide. They would do it something like this. There'd be a jar, oftentimes pottery, and they would just stick their valuables in it. And so all throughout the Roman world, the Byzantine Empire, ancient Israel, even England, because of a lot of history that happened in medieval times and just past that, and even with World War II, there have been people who have just been digging in their backyard, and they've come across these treasures that have been buried for hundreds or even thousands of years, because that was a common way of protecting your valuables. Kind of like the stories you hear of maybe during the Depression, people hiding some money under their mattress or something like that, because it was a time of instability, and throughout all of human history, when things get unstable, what they would do is take their valuables, hide them in a jar, protect them from the elements, and bury them somewhere. And they knew where it was, so when things got more stable, they would just go and unbury them. But that way they wouldn't get robbed, or those things wouldn't get stolen in those times of instability. And people have been digging those up on occasion ever since. But burying treasure has been a common practice throughout history during these times of unrest. And that's kind of the story that Jesus is telling. Somebody stumbles across one of those jars that's got someone's treasure in it in a field, somebody who's died or since been forgotten, or the land is transferred to someone else. And so he says, that field and that treasure is worth everything I own. I'm all in. I'm selling it all. because I need the money to buy that. But when I have that, I'm going to have so much more than I currently have. And the idea is that when you enter into God's kingdom and you live for God, the reward is going to be something that's priceless. There's nothing that you can compare it to. In fact, it's worth more than all that you currently possess. And maybe you want to think about that for a moment. What do you currently possess? What's your net worth? Do you have a house? How much equity do you have in your house? Do you have a savings account or checking account? Do you have certain possessions that add to your worth? Do you have investments or a portfolio that way? What is your net worth? And in this story, what Jesus is offering is so many more times valuable than your net worth. It's a no-brainer that you would let go of it all and you would buy in and invest into his kingdom, because the reward, the benefit is going to so much outweigh it. Like everyone, if they could truly see, if they could truly discover the value in God's kingdom, they would say, I want to let go of that in a heartbeat to pour my life into what you have, because the end result and the reward is so much greater than anything I could experience in and of my own effort here in this life. And to kind of put a capstone on that, Jesus tells this final parable. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. Because a treasure is great, but in ancient times in the Roman Empire, a pearl was sort of like the pinnacle of value. And I mentioned this when we talked about casting pearls before swine several chapters ago in Matthew. But here's some detail that I'm going to bring back in just briefly about pearls. Roman citizens, they would adorn their couches, furniture, things like that with a pearl as a way to flaunt how significant they were socially. They would sometimes sleep in pearls or sew them into their gowns. And they were so highly valued that there was actually a Roman general, his name was Vitellius, and he financed his entire military campaign by selling just one of his mom's pearl earrings. So there were grades of pearls, and he had one that was of extremely high price, enough to finance an entire military campaign with it. And one of the most, famous stories in the Roman tradition took place at a banquet. And this banquet was given by Cleopatra, who was an Egyptian empress at the time, in honor of the Roman leader Mark Antony. And she tried to convince Mark Antony that Egypt was so wealthy that it was like above conquest. So you don't want to attack Egypt and try to take over Egypt, because we just have such a vast, endless amount of wealth, like it wouldn't even be worth your time to try to do that. And the way that she did that, she said, I bet I can provide the most expensive banquet that's ever been provided with only one container of sour wine, so vinegar. And the way that she did that, according to this story, is she removed one of her pearl earrings that was supposed to have been worth 60 million sesterces, Roman sesterces, which was equivalent to 1,875,000 ounces of silver in value at the time. It was said to be the largest pearl in the world, and she crushed it and dropped it into that container of sour wine. And supposedly, as she drank that down, Mark Antony basically said, you won the wager. You won the wager, because she had another pearl earring here as well, and she was willing to use that. That's how valuable pearls were. To put it somewhat within grasp of us, let's say it would be equivalent to finding that $2.04 billion Powerball ticket that came out a couple of weeks ago, or maybe discovering one of the most priceless works of art throughout history. That's the only thing that you could come up with in your mind to equate to a fine pearl in this story. And Jesus is saying, imagine the most fine thing possible. That's what you've discovered when you've discovered my kingdom. It's an amazing discovery, and there's such a huge difference. But yet, so many people said, nice stories, Jesus. We don't understand. What are you talking about? But the question is, do we understand? And do we value what Jesus is offering? And that's for us personally to decide. But let's go ahead and wrap things up with prayer today. God, I thank you for a chance to explore more about this kingdom. In fact, throughout Matthew's entire gospel, we've seen glimpses of what your kingdom is about week after week after week. And here you're really putting it before us and saying, how are you going to respond? Each of us, how are we going to respond to this? Are we going to see you and your kingdom as something that's so valuable we want to pour our life into it? Is it more valuable than all of our other pursuits and possessions? Or is it something that we just sort of say, that's nice. I'll be interested around Christmas and Easter. Besides that time, I think I'll just kind of live for myself in this world. But you really call us to decide which kingdom we want to be a part of, because there's a huge difference. And there's a huge difference in final results. So help us to weigh those things today in mind of these parables that you're giving us. In Jesus' name, amen.